So in Europe, up until the 10th century, more or less, the economy was based on was a feudal agricultural economy based on subsistence farming. Okay. But from the 10th to the 14th century, there was a huge demographic and economic shift in Europe, and there was an enormous amount of growth. Agricultural production increased, and there was a revival of trade over both long and short distances. And this was known as the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, and it led to a change in the economy. The economy became more like a market economy, with circulation of goods and money, and less to do with subsistence farming. Before, generally, the food was produced in the local area, and food and goods that were needed were produced in the local area and used by the people who lived there. But during the commercial revolution, with the increase in trade, goods and money started to circulate more. Now, one of the main actors in this process was the merchant. Merchants had contact with different languages, different civilizations, and different cultures as they travelled around. And as the economy grew, a new mentality emerged, which was more dynamic and more industrious than the old feudal mentality that had prevailed before. From the 7th to the 10th centuries, merchants were isolated characters on the margins of society. They were like adventurers, really, and they travelled around with their goods on their shoulders, from fair to fair, from castle to castle, and sold their wares. But as time went by, they became more practical and more capitalist, and more like professional businessmen. And as they accumulated money, many of them formed companies, and some even commercial empires. And gradually, they were becoming more like modern business people. The city in the Middle Ages was a place of meetings and trade. In fact, it was the heart of the medieval economy. From the 11th century onwards, foreign merchants filled the cities of Europe. These merchants came from different parts of Europe and also from the East. In Italy, there were maritime cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were particularly important, and inland Ferrara, Siena, Milan, and Florence. They were centres for fairs and markets, and they grew because of their strategic position. So with this increased commerce, manufacturing increased as well, and this was particularly the case for the production of wool, silk, and cotton. And with increased commerce and manufacturing, the first banks started to emerge. But when I say the first banks, that's probably not in fact the truth, because during the classical period, during Greek and Roman times, there were banks before. But after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, they went into decline. So perhaps it would be better to say the rebirth of the banks took place. And they became necessary because there were more businesses and more investment. And a freer, more open way of life began to develop, which was unlike the rigid feudal hierarchies that had existed before. And the mentality was more rational and more secular. And money and profit became important values. In the second half of the 12th century, many new gold and silver coins were minted all over Europe. And these coins travelled around the continent with men and goods as they circulated. And because of these new demands of the circulation of money, banks became important for this reason as well. Initially, the banks were controlled by the most important merchant families because of the connection between the merchants and the economy. It was the merchants who needed the investment, and to begin with, it was them who controlled the banks. And new credit systems emerged as well. And the Italians were pioneers in this sector. And one example of this is the Bill of Exchange, which was a document which could be used to travel without carrying large quantities of silver and gold coins. And also there were systems of deposit. So money could be paid into a bank and then withdrawn when the payee wanted, when the person who invested the money wanted it, or it could be transferred to another city. Loans also became much more common at all levels of society, from farmers to craftsmen to ship owners to kings. So these new banks and these new ways of financing were crucial for exploration across the oceans that began during the 15th and 16th centuries, and for investing in colonial enterprises, which changed the world economy in a drastic way. There was a very important change took place when Constantinople was conquered by the Turks, and the Ottoman Empire took control of the trade routes between Europe and Asia. And after this happened, Europeans began to search for new directions for their trade, and began to explore over oceans, and it became increasingly popular to trade by sea over the oceans rather than using the old trade routes from the east, which were now controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And America was discovered, and colonies were established along the coasts of sub-Saharan Africa and in the so-called East Indies. And this led to the decline of the Mediterranean as the centre of commerce and trade. And a new phase in history began, a phase that was characterised by colonial exploitation and the beginning of the global market. Initially, Spain and Portugal were the main actors in this process, and later France, Britain and the Netherlands. So a very well-known family, which is the Medici family, which I'm sure you've all heard of, were in fact they made their fortune originally from banking. Giovanni di Medici was the banker for Pope John the 23rd, and he made an enormous fortune. And the Medicis became the greatest bankers in Europe. Their economic rise led to a social and political rise as well. And in 1435, Cosimo the Elder was the most powerful man on the political scene in Florence. The Medici family reigned for more than 3 centuries, and their coat of arms can be seen everywhere in Florence, even in churches. So,